If you're watching this on YouTube, you might have noticed that this episode is a week delayed. But if you want to get early access to our episodes, consider becoming a paying member. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with your friends. Thank you for all your support. Deepak Chopra is a medical doctor with mystical leanings who has built a highly successful second career as a purveyor of alternative remedies and deepities that I would say, and here I suppose I show my bias, impress those who think that if they can't understand something, it must be profoundly significant. As part of my Channel 4 documentary, Enemies of Reason, I asked him to explain his concept of quantum healing. We went on from there.
Could you explain your revolutionary ideas on quantum healing and any evidence there may be that it works?
Quantum healing is just a theory that I proposed many years ago, and now Dr. Amit Goswami, who's a professor of quantum physics at Oregon State University, is also talking about it, is just the theory that a shift in consciousness creates a shift in biology. That's it. So, if you're stressed, your adrenaline and your cortisol levels and many other neuropeptides cause physiological chaos. On the other hand, if you have an internally induced state of euphoria, then you have the simultaneous release of things like serotonin and dopamine and opiates and oxytocin, which also happen to be immunomodulators. So a shift in consciousness causes a shift in biology.
Okay. Especially in the immune system or
No, an overall homeostasis.
Okay. Yes.
Homeostasis allows for spontaneous healing mechanisms to work.
Right. But where did the quantum theory come into that?
Oh, it's just a metaphor, just like an electron or a photon is an indivisible unit of information and energy. A thought is an indivisible unit of consciousness.
Oh, so it's a metaphor for a unit. It's nothing to do with quantum theory as in physics.
No, I think quantum theory has a lot of things to say about observer effect, about non-locality, about correlation. So I think there are a school of physicists who believe that consciousness has to be equated, or at least brought into the equation in understanding quantum mechanics.
Yes, but when you use it, you're using it as a metaphor, which I fully understand. I mean, the quantum as a metaphor.
Right.
Right. So it's a metaphor. It's actually confusion, isn't it, to bring in quantum theory other than as a metaphor? But it sounds as though you're both doing it as a metaphor and a little tinge of something like what physicists are talking about as well.
Well, I think there's controversy. There are a school of physicists who believe that quantum leaps, for example, are examples of discontinuity. And creativity in consciousness is also an example of discontinuity. And that healing may be a biological phenomenon that relies on biological creativity. That at very fundamental levels, it may be a discontinuous phenomenon. It's something unpredictable that happens in the proliferation of uncertainty.
So it sounds like a sort of poetic use of the word discontinuity. It was taking two very different kinds of discontinuity and muddling them up.
Maybe that's your interpretation, but I've spoken to some really good physicists who feel that quantum physics is unexplainable in the absence of consciousness, in the absence of, you can't explain things like observer effect, and the discontinuity, in fact, may be consciousness itself.
You've often said that there's more to the world than science can reveal. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think science is based on a purely objective examination of the world. And I think reality is both subjective and objective. Reality is the observer, the process of observation, and that which we observe. And in science, we have a particular method of observing which excludes our subjectivity And so I think science ends up being not an examination of nature itself, but an examination of the questions we ask of nature and nature's response to those questions. And if we exclude subjectivity, we're excluding a major activity of nature, because after all, our own subjectivity are also a pattern of behavior of what we call nature.
Would you accept that although in the activity of curing as a healer, you can be subjective, but when you want to test and demonstrate that your methods work, that there you have to be objective and use scientific
I think we may have to revise our protocols there, because the purely objective method of studying, say, medical outcomes excludes the very thing we are talking about, and that is consciousness. You can have two patients who have the same disease, they see the same physician, they have the same treatment, and they have completely different outcomes, some of which, of course, can be explained through genetics, but a lot of it is really inexplicable unless you include the subjectivity of the patient, the patient-doctor interaction, the phenomenon of limbic resonance, which is emotional bonding between healer and the one being healed, which actually is now known to result in homeostasis, which is a very important part of the healing process.
Nevertheless, if you were to get 1,000 patients, divide them up into two groups, and half of them are treated by limbic resonance or quantum healing, whatever you like, and the other half are treated by the sort of conventional medicine that you learned originally as a doctor, wouldn't you think there's an interest in detecting any difference between the effectiveness of those two treatments objectively?
There is, except that even in those cases, 30% of responses are what are called placebo responses. And, even though we try and control for placebos, you can't, because you really don't know what is happening in a patient's life, whether he's in the midst of a stormy divorce, or his children have sickness, or he's lost his job, all of which are very crucial determinants in the outcome of a disease.
You can't control everything for every patient, but nevertheless,
you can't control 90% of what's happening in a patient's life.
I mean, you presumably do believe in controlled trials.
I believe that as we move into the future of clinical investigation, we'll have determinants of states of consciousness and then controlled trials in those states of consciousness. Because unless you include consciousness as a very crucial factor, it's impossible to have a fully mechanistic approach to healing.
How do you respond to skeptics who say that your methods are not proven?
My most usual response to skeptics is, I don't believe you. No, I'm not being facetious, but I think you can never convince a skeptic. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, as the phrase goes. But I would say that there are over several thousand studies in really good medical journals that now concretely establish the role of subjectivity in the healing phenomenon.
I'm sure that's right, because subjectivity would include psychosomatic medicine, would include the placebo effect, which is undeniable.
But subjectivity has an enormous role in infections, because infections are related to compromised immune systems, which have a lot to do with human suffering. Cancer, which has a lot to do with compromised immune systems, which again have a lot to do with suffering. Suffering, 90% of suffering is subjective. You can have two people exactly the same amount of injury, and they have completely different internal feelings. Now we have to say that these internal feelings have very specific biological consequences.
I don't doubt that for a single moment, and I think that most doctors would accept.
And I think there are many scientific studies that show that patients, who are waiting for Christmas will not die till Christmas happens.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
So on.
So very important for any doctor to take into account subjective influences. That's undisputed. I suppose what is a bit more worrying is the use of, I don't know whether to call it mumbo jumbo or
I think, if you don't understand language, you call it mumbo jumbo.
Well,
the ancient shamans used language that nobody understands. Science uses Latin mumbo jumbo that nobody understands.
The question is whether you're using language.
When you're talking about something that's different, you have to use a vocabulary.
Yes.
And if people are not familiar with the vocabulary, it sounds mumbo jumbo.
Yes, but what if it's deliberately using language that the patient doesn't understand in order to...
I think it's very important to to make the patient understand. That's one of the big failures of modern medicine, and the disgruntlement in people with modern medicine, because they don't understand what the doctor is talking about. So anytime a new vocabulary is used, it's very important to make it understood.
Yeah. But every time you use a word like quantum healing, which sounds terribly scientific.
I think I'm able to explain it. The only people who criticize me are who actually don't have the experience of what we're talking about. And the response from nobody in the lay public calls it mumbo jumbo. Only the aficionados in the world of quantum physics have somehow hijacked the word for their own use.
Oh, okay. So they've hijacked your word.
I think what happens is that there are fundamentalists, both in science and in religion. And, like right now, the word intelligent design has been hijacked by both the religious fundamentalists and the school of evolutionists who only use it, to attack any form of creativity other than simple adaptation. And you're the world's expert who's talking about memes and other things that influence society, which are really, examples of what consciousness can do.
Is there a danger that you're giving credibility to old superstitions that are now outmoded?
I think I'm trying my best to explain wisdom traditions, and there is a lot of superstition in old traditions that needs to be discarded. I look at healing traditions from all over the world, and I would say that 80% of it is superstition and should be discarded. But the perennial philosophy, of which Aldous Huxley spoke of, stands on its own ground and has a worldview which is very holistic, that if we really understood it, we wouldn't have all the eco disasters that we are having, and the totally mechanistic approach that human beings are here to conquer nature and not to be an expression of it.
So if you reject 80% of it, how do you decide which is the 20% that you accept?
Well, as I go through my experience and my experience of patients and my readings, I look at what really could be explained with our current understanding of cosmology or biology or evolution or mind-body connections, or the role that consciousness plays in evoking biological responses. Really, the major difference between, say, what I say and the reductionists say is that mechanisms cannot explain origins of disease, and to have a purely mechanistic approach of here's an infection, use the antibiotic, here's the cancer, use the chemotherapy. This mechanistic approach has led to a lot of disasters. In this morning's newspaper, I read that 10,000 people die in the UK every year as a result of adverse reactions to drugs. And it's also true that 80% of the drugs that we use are of optional or marginal benefit, that 36% of patients in hospitals suffer from iatrogenic disease that disease patients have because they went to see a doctor. So I think we have to really understand that the mechanistic approach, whilst it's very good in certain situations, is not really the total answer, because mechanisms of disease are not origins of disease. Origins of disease has to do with how we think, how we behave, how we interact, what goes on in our daily lives, the innumerable factors that make for living: eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, elimination, sensory experience, thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, instincts, drives, memories, all of which are part of the human biological organism.
I'm sure we'd agree that there's an awful lot we don't understand, and science's quest is to try to sort out, to tease out those bits that we don't understand.
Science has become so arrogant in its premise that it has all the answers in a mechanistic approach, that it has, whilst it has gotten rid of lots of things like polio and malaria and tuberculosis in many parts of the world, we are now seeing the emergence of modern epidemics that are a result of some of the things that have come about through science. The fact that nosocomial infections are actually more dangerous than infections acquired naturally as a result of overuse of antibiotics. The fact that medical accidents are the equivalent of 3 jumbo jets crashing every other day. If any other industry had this record, other than medicine, we wouldn't tolerate it.
Well, I think it's perhaps unfair to blame medicine for that, but let me say that I think science, some individual scientists may be arrogant. Scientists are not confident that they have all the answers. That is absolutely wrong. Scientists may be confident that they have the best ways of answering the questions. They don't even have all the questions. They have the best ways of answering the questions.
See, science has focused on that which can be observed. Psychology has focused on the process of observation, you might say. But there's no science yet that looks at the observer. Who's this person? What do I, if I'm at least in medical science, I want to know what your disease is, but I also know all the context and the meanings and the purpose of your living, which are responsible for your biology.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I believe you said there's no such thing as a meaningless coincidence. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, I've picked up on the writings of Carl Jung and also his friend Wolfgang Pauli, who said that what I call meaningful coincidences are examples of synchronicity, and somehow tried to relate that idea to quantum non-locality, which is correlation at fundamental levels of creation. For example, a human body has 100 trillion cells, and each cell does over 100,000 things, and every cell has to instantly track what every other cell is doing in order to keep alive. How does a human body think thoughts and play a piano and kill germs and remove toxins and make a baby all at once while tracking the movements of the cosmos as its biological rhythms? There's no mechanistic explanation for that, or even for morphogenesis and differentiation, how a single cell divides 50 times to become 100 trillion cells, which is more than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So at fundamental levels of creation, I think there is no randomness, there is correlation. And a coincidence is an example of that correlation, of that acausal, non-local relatedness that occurs in this plant or in the movements of the cosmos or in your own biology, which is correlated with all these activities.
What about spirituality and the supernatural?
I think anything that we don't understand, we call it the supernatural. Once you understand it, you call it science. So lots of so-called miracles of yesterday are today's science. So I don't believe that there's anything that's supernatural. On the other hand, I believe that spirit, which is synonymous with consciousness, can be a domain of awareness where we experience our universality. And in that experience, there's love, there's compassion, there's understanding, there's context, there's meaning, there's purpose, there's the understanding of what it means to be intuitive, to be creative, to understand the role of intentionality. And these are aspects of spirituality that are very useful in understanding everything from behavior to cognition to moods, emotions, biology, environment, ecology.
If you define the supernatural as everything that we don't understand, I've got to agree with you. There's an awful lot we don't understand, and science needs to work on that. And as you say, when we understand it, then it becomes science. The danger with supernatural is that because there are some things that people don't yet understand, they assume that they're onto something, that there is something that one day will be understood. Whereas it could be that a great deal of what people don't understand will never be embraced into that which we understand. It'll simply be rejected, like Thor and his hammer and all that.
I think in our lifetime, or in several generations, if we survive the predicted eco-disasters, we probably will not understand, and therefore I don't like the word supernatural myself. I think we should always quest to understand, and that science is one of the great methodologies for understanding, and maybe one day science will explain why we fall in love, or why we are moved by poetry, what is imagination and intention and love and compassion, maybe.
Well, I look forward to that time, and I think you do. But I think you didn't quite get my point. I expressed it very badly. I was trying to say that all over the world there are numerous things which are called supernatural and which you don't believe in and I don't believe in and don't believe they ever will become science. How do we decide when we look at a belief which we encounter today, whether it's supernatural in the sense of is all just nonsense, and supernatural in the sense of one day will become a part of science?
Well, I think belief in any form, whether it's belief in a scientific ideology or dogma that we're attached to and we're not willing to see it crumble, or belief in a religious idea, is usually a cover-up for insecurity. And all believers are dangerous because they're fundamentalists, essentially, which have caused havoc in the world. On the other hand, faith is the willingness to step into the unknown. And in that sense, a great scientist is one who has faith.
Has a certain kind of faith, but
a willingness to step into the unknown and relinquish all the ideas that they're attached to, whether, because that's scientific progress.
Yes, but not a blind faith which will never be shaken.
No, absolutely.
We agree about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've been accused of selling false hope. What's your answer to that?
I think the false hope is an oxymoron. Either you have hope or you don't. And I also think, we tell our patients, believe the diagnosis, but don't necessarily believe the prognosis. Prognosis is based on statistics, and statistics never tell you about individual outcomes. For example, the average temperature in Oxford for the year doesn't tell me what the temperature is right now. Or the average income of a person from London doesn't tell me your income if you come from London. So to prognosticate is really to sometimes introduce the opposite of the placebo response, which is called the nocebo response, like the witch doctor who points a bone and the patient starts to vomit and get dehydrated in 24 hours. And, we don't think of ourselves as witch doctors because we don't wear leopard skins, we wear white coats. We don't have feathers around our neck, we have stethoscopes. We don't dance around fires, we dance around CAT scanners, and we don't use Aborigine mantras, we use Latin mantras, but we have much the same effect as witch doctors on our patients.
That's a bit unfair.
But we do have that effect. Mrs. Smith, you've got cancer, you have 6 months to live. Well, she believes you, she's going to have 6 months to live.
What do you do when Mrs. Smith comes to you with cancer?
We work with oncologists, and we have oncologists on our staff, so we follow conventional treatments, protocols, if they're effective. But at the same time, we get deeply into the history and personal history of a patient, their relationships, their fears, their hopes, their work habits. It's now known that the number one time that people die in our civilization is at 9 o'clock on Monday morning because they hate their jobs. Now, no other animal has been able to accomplish this extraordinary feat. So we try and get into every aspect of a patient's life, their relationships, their job satisfaction, their inner fears, their hopes, their dreams, and then we combine it with a ritual of deep meditation, diet, massage, sometimes various herbal supplements and antioxidants, and conventional treatments, and really a lot of spiritual counseling, including the fear of death. We think that many times patients feel healed even though they may die from a disease if they learn to go beyond their personal fear of death. And you can never do that unless you have a patient have a spiritual experience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, we've got a really exciting announcement. We want you personally to join us for 2 days of discussions and debate, all happening at the inaugural Dissident Dialogues 2024. This epic event will take place in Brooklyn on May 3rd and 4th. We will be joining leading thinkers such as Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, John McWhorter, Konstantin Kisin, Francis Foster, and so many more. We want you to join us for a gathering where absolutely everyone is part of the conversation. Conservatives, progressives, atheists, theists, left, right, and everything in between. Dissident Dialogues presents a rare opportunity to immerse yourself in a conversation with the most influential thinkers of our time. We will tackle important topics relating to religion, science, politics, and culture. So if you are driven by intellectual honesty, curiosity, and a desire for the truth, then Dissident Dialogues is definitely the place for you. This is not just an event, this is a beginning of an intellectual journey. And we want you to come along for the ride. Dissident Dialogues, a place for dangerous ideas. Buy your tickets now at dissidentdialogues.org and be part of the conversation.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can show some support by subscribing to the podcast, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a review.